I'm boarding a plane again. I don't know how many planes I've flown in during my 30-something years of life. A lot. At least 2 per year. I don't think I lived a year of my life without flying somewhere. But this plane, the one that would take me to Cuba, was special. This entire trip to Cuba was special, full of surprises and unexpected perspectives. A whole new world. And it started with boarding a massive 777 jetliner that was practically empty. Weird.
Today, I can announce that the United States has agreed to formally reestablish diplomatic relations with the Republic of Cuba.
You know there's a story going around about the CIA and they're trying to get, sending in the folks to get Castro.
Cuba maintains close relations with Russia and China, providing these actors with influence platforms to foment an anti-American
agenda. The Florida State
agenda.
Court has ruled on the case regarding temporary custody of Elian Gonzalez.
I think you ought to have that. It's incredible. I don't believe this thing in the world could. I don't think you ought to seriously consider it, but I think you ought to know about it.
The progress that we mark today is yet another demonstration that we don't have to be imprisoned by the past. When something isn't working, we can and will change.
Now, don't get me wrong. It was a delightful surprise to have a whole 4 middle seats of a plane to myself. You bet I turned it into my personal lounger for the whole 45 minutes. But it was strange. I mean, it made sense in a way. This was the end of 2022, still waves of COVID coming through, you know? But the dissonance of such a huge plane, going such a short distance, being so empty. Listen, I live in the DC metro area. The flight to Philadelphia is longer. Hell, the flight from Miami to Orlando is longer. It was uncanny. A lot about my relationship with Cuba is uncanny. It doesn't quite make sense. It's not neat or black and white. I don't know if I'll ever fully square my life into the round black hole that is my heritage, my ancestral history. In this episode, I want to talk about the elephant in the room. The reason why the United States is so very, very hostile towards this little island just 90 miles from our shores, and vice versa. The reason, apparently, I am here in the first place. Yeah, this is going to be a History 101 episode. Buckle up. Don't worry, I'll sprinkle in my first day in Cuba with it. If you're going to know anything about the Cuban Revolution, though, you need to know about Spanish colonization and the Spanish-American War. Unsurprisingly, I have family members who were part of both. Plus the Spanish Civil War, but we won't go hard into that one just yet. Just know that I am descended from a particular breed of troublemaker. Now, many of you might understand that Cuba was under Spanish rule since Europe decided to colonize what we now know of as the Caribbean islands, and obviously beyond. Cuba was originally home to the Taino and Guanahatabe peoples, who themselves were matriarchal and are believed to be descended from the Arawak peoples of the Amazon basin. Even that asshole Columbus admitted these people were kind, intelligent, and joyful. But contrary to popular belief, indigenous people were not completely wiped out from Cuba. Despite lynchings and disease and genocide, their descendants are still alive in Cuba. In fact, they survived by creating community with Africans who were forcibly brought to the island. I'll get into that particular story in another episode, though. This is simply to say that the story of Cuba and the Cuban people is very similar to most of the rest of the so-called New World, and especially the Caribbean. The Europeans arrive, they enslave and murder and forcibly convert, and establish a very lucrative business of sugar and tobacco on the island. Follow the money, folks. I'm not going to, pardon the pun, sugarcoat my ancestors. This is part of my story that I am not at all proud about. But let's continue. The Spanish-American War was the culmination of a lot of regional tensions, not just attempted Cuban independence from Spain. The United States of America has always been interested in its own form of colonization. The Monroe Doctrine was a part of this. the concept of the US of A as the Western Hemisphere's policemen under the auspices that they were supporting independence movements. Just before the American Civil War, in fact, there was something called the Ostend Manifesto. The Ostend Manifesto was a circulated policy letter from Southern slave owners and policymakers who declared an intention to purchase Cuba from Spain and to declare war if Spain refused. This would, of course, expand slavers' interests and turn Cuba into a slaveholding state. It would take the latter half of the century for this to actually come to pass. Well, the war bit, at least. Slavery would have been abolished by the time the U.S. invaded Cuba. But you know what? The funny thing is, sugar and tobacco, and the tons of money that came with it, was still a part of it. Are you getting it yet? The reasoning behind this conflict? Maybe. Well, let's detour a bit to my landing in Havana. No sooner as I set up my little lounge area across 4 seats, put my feet up for a little power nap, I had gotten up really early that morning after all, that we were already preparing to descend. Honestly, I was not prepared for how short the flight was. I knew intellectually that this was less than an hour. But physically, emotionally, I was not prepared. I watched as water flashed into land, coming closer and closer. I moved over to an open window row to watch. My breathing grew shallow, and it started to hit me. I'm the first one back. The land was rushing up to meet me, and it felt like those moments when you haven't seen your loved ones for months, and you finally see them beyond the security gate, jumping up and down, a sense of finally, it has been too long, mi niña linda. Tears began to form in my eyes. They're welling up now, remembering. I brushed them away, desperate to drink in every second of my first sight of Cuban soil. The bounce of the wheels hitting tarmac was like a bumpy embrace of an overenthusiastic relative. Tears dropped, and I inhaled. I was in Cuba. I was a little worried about the process of getting through customs, but it was actually a breeze. I had already done all the paperwork. I was bustled through without so much as a pause. I didn't even get a stamp on my passport. The bright, humid, breezy air was a delight in December. Like I mentioned, I had already booked my taxi, and he was there waiting for me outside. Louis was a kind man, and I was absolutely buzzing with excitement, and I think he could tell. He recommended that I only convert a small amount of my dollars to Cuban pesos at the airport. Street conversion was better, and dollars were still accepted by some vendors. He brought me to the car, a beautiful sky blue classic with a white hardtop. You know, the 1950s old-school cars that are a mainstay on Cuban postcards. We spoke to each other in Spanish, my Cuban accent coming through in response. No soy fluida, pero I was able to give a little bit more of my story. As I slid into the passenger seat, Louis offered to take me around a little bit before dropping me off at my Airbnb. It was still pretty early in the afternoon, after all. He could take me to see one of the big sites, Plaza de la Revolución, where stands the famous José Martí memorial statue, and steel Che Guevara facade on a ministry building. I agreed, and also asked afterwards if he could take me to the Vedado neighborhood. I told Louis about a house that my grandfather wanted me to visit, that he used to work at. A house his uncle or great-uncle, I can't remember, used to own. I had the name of the house, but not the address. Villa Lita. Louis agreed happily. He knew the area. Sure enough, we were on our way. I took some video, some pictures. You can see that on some of our social media. Yes, I know that's just wind in the car, but it's Cuban wind. We got to Vedado, circled the block, and parked right near one of the museums in the area. There were a few houses around, so we walked up and down, until finally, I saw it across the street. On the corner of 13th and Paseo sits a white stone house, surrounded by a wrought iron gate. 2 stories tall, square, except for the sweeping archways leading to the front doors. quintessentially Spanish architecture. Villa Lita, etched into the cornice. It was a museum, but it was closed for construction. Louis took a photo of me in front of it. My phone had no service, so I couldn't yet share the photo with my family. Later, my grandfather lamented how run down it looked. I could hear the undertone of that comment. See, Lisette? See how the communists neglect these beautiful buildings? I can't help but think about that sense of conflict. Was my family really entitled to such beautiful buildings built off of others' suffering? Let's get back to our B-plot. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was the culmination of the Cuba Libre movement, which had attempted independence from Spain with revolts beginning in the late 1860s. The Cuban War for Independence was led by the liberation intellectual and eventually martyred José Martí. Martí actually noted the U.S.'s growing interest with the liberation movement with concern. He saw what happened in Hawaii. He saw that his nation was stuck between two world powers who had no intention to realize a completely independent Cuba. Unfortunately, José Martí was killed by Spanish troops in the Battle of Dos Rios in 1895. Only a few years later, the USS Maine incident in Havana kicked off the Spanish-American War and invited further U.S. involvement on the island. Now, I remember learning about the USS Maine in my AP U.S. History class. Some of you might also remember that this section was tied closely to the lesson on yellow journalism. It was during that time that U.S. newspapers could fire up public sentiment using lurid and exaggerated language, disparaging Spain, and sometimes quite violent terms. Now, despite initial feelings otherwise, it has been pretty much settled that the Spanish likely did torpedo the Maine. But I find it interesting that sensationalist headlines, as we know them now, originated in response to events in Cuba. What's interesting is that Americans really did feel a kinship to the Cuban fight for independence. It was wrapped up in the rhetoric of U.S. independence from Britain and eventually the Civil War. Black Americans, in particular, were vocal in their support for Cuban freedom. The humanitarian sentiment generated by these headlines towards the Cuban independence movement certainly translated to government support of war against Spain. In the century since, there is still debate as to the true motivations of the powers that be. Theodore Roosevelt himself mentioned the lucrative interests of Cuba's sugar and tobacco alongside his more noble motivations, but other political scientists noted that financial interests of Wall Street were against the war. Perhaps we can't be sure where exactly righteousness mixes with self-interest. I have to be careful about this myself. Perhaps I can blame my ancestors for having that classic hubris problem, but I sometimes find myself pumped up on justice only when I have something to gain from it. Sometimes it is more humbling to sit with my feelings and observe instead. Louis dropped me off at my Airbnb, a little studio near the top of an apartment tower overlooking the Malecón, that famous seaside walkway that lines Havana's shore. After tipping Louis, I followed my Airbnb host up to the unit. There, he gave me the Wi-Fi, which he apologized for being slow and limited, but he suggested a few apps to help navigate Havana, reminded me about the benefit of converting money on the street, again, and told me to let him know if I needed anything. And there I was, landed. I unpacked for my 5 days, counted my cash, put my necessaries into the safe, ate a snack I brought from home, and let my family know I hadn't been detained or whatever. The sun was beginning to set when I decided to walk the Malecón before dinner. It was just across the street, and it was mostly deserted. It was a weekday, after all. I took some pictures and decided to walk until I wanted to stop. The sun was dipping low. It was a clear day. It was beautiful. I stopped when my feet told me to, and hopped up onto the short seawall to stare out into the water. Hola, I told Havana. Soy Lisette Denise Alvarez. Mi sangre está aquí. I'm happy to meet you. Finally. And I sobbed. I felt the immensity of the time, of space, of the war, and more crash into me. The gravity of being the first one back here. My family's stories, the complicated feelings about that. And the grief. I sat with all that, letting it flow through me, letting the sound of the waves accompany the storm of emotion inside me. It wasn't absolution, but it was a kind of release. A generational curse, a silence, a loss. Whatever word you want to use. I felt it lifted, like a veil. I am one of those witchy people, okay? Trained for over a decade, actually, in the occult and esoteric. Longer than that, if you consider the fact I grew up in the back room of my Nana's New Age store. But when I say this was a spiritual experience, imagine someone who believes that I carry and am carried by my ancestors. That epigenetic awareness that is also soul work. I used my most spiritual tool, my body, to transform and transmit the trauma of my family to the point of origin. This was just the first step, of course, but I needed that moment on the Malecón, between earth and sea, to cleanse me, to prepare me. I wanted to allow myself to mentally, emotionally, and spiritually experience Cuba, without the clamor of my family's thoughts and feelings. This is the work. On my walk down the Malecón, I could see the famous Hotel Nacional de Cuba, just down the road from where I was staying. You can't really miss it. It's gigantic, opulent. As an American, I wasn't allowed to stay there. Trust me, I checked. I mean, I think the embargo definitely cares that this is the hotel where the Havana conference was held. What is the Havana conference, you ask? Oh, nothing big. Just a mob summit in 1946 that was inspiration behind the second Godfather movie.
Respected gentlemen, muy respetados caballeros, allow me to welcome you to the city of Havana. Permítame darles la bienvenida a la ciudad de La Habana. I want to thank this distinguished group of American industrialists a este distinguido grupo de industriales norteamericanos for continuing to work with Cuba, por continuar trabajando con Cuba, for the greatest period of prosperity, por el más grande periodo de prosperidad in our entire history, en toda nuestra historia. Mr. Robert Allen of South American Sugar, señor Robert Allen de la South American Sugar, and Mr. Michael Corleone of Nevada, y señor Michael Corleone de Nevada, representing our associates in tourism and leisure activities, y actividades de placer.
I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on in here. Let me clarify. After the Spanish-American War and Cuban independence, things weren't all clear. Jose Marti was mostly right. Cuba was too valuable to be totally free. During the first decades of the 20th century, Cuba was plagued with corruption, from an American diplomat directing a coup and passing off lucrative contracts to U.S. business interests, to the sugar boom leading to increased economic inequality, to the growing influence of organized crime on the island. The former Cuban president and eventual deposed dictator, Fulgencio Batista, exacerbated all these points in the years leading to the Cuban Revolution, ending the right to strike, violently cracked down on communists and protesters and labor leaders alike, while filling his and his Mafia buddies' pockets. By the time Batista himself was overthrown, foreign interests, primarily United States, owned up to 70% of agricultural businesses in Cuba. What did I say? Follow the money.
Molasses to rum to slaves who sail the ships back to Boston, laden with gold, see it gleam, whose fortunes are made in the triangle trade. Hail slavery, the New England dream. Mr. Adams, I give you a toast. Hail Boston! Hail Charleston! Who stinketh the most?
So yes, Cuba was ripe for revolution by the time the 1950s rolled around. But we'll get to some of that later. Next episode, we're moving away from the material and towards the spiritual. Stay tuned.